What do you think makes people unpleasant? Story 1. I once shared a house with a guy who could never admit he was wrong. One morning he swore the toaster was broken because his bread wouldn't toast. I asked if he'd plugged it in, and he rolled his eyes like I'd insulted his intelligence. "Of course I plugged it in," he said, holding up the unplugged cord. When I pointed it out, he muttered, "Well, it's probably still defective." That same night, he tripped over the same toaster cord and blamed me for leaving it where someone could get hurt. I just started keeping my snacks in my room. Story 2. There was a guy in my office who always interrupted everyone mid-sentence with, "Actually." One day, during a meeting, he tried to actually the CEO about the company's own policies. The CEO just stared at him and said, "Actually, you're fired." Best meeting ever. Story 3. My old coworker Carol was the queen of backhanded compliments. One day I came into the office wearing a new dress, and she said, "Wow, you're so brave to wear that color." Brave? Was I going into battle? Another time I brought in homemade cookies, and she told me, "These are surprisingly good for being from a box mix." I finally snapped when she commented on my haircut with, "Short hair makes your face look interesting." I shot back, "Thanks, and your honesty makes you unforgettable." She didn't talk to me for a week. Best week ever. Story 4. My friend's ex once brought up his high school football glory days at every dinner. When someone asked what position he played, he said, "Bench warmer, but emotionally I was the MVP." We all laughed. He didn't. Story 5. I once had a neighbor who hated fun. Like, genuinely despised it. One time I set up a sprinkler in my yard for my niece and nephew to play in, and within 10 minutes, she was banging on my door to complain that the water droplets might drift onto her hydrangeas. Another time she called the cops because I was having a small barbecue, and the smell of grilled meat was offensive. When I put up Christmas lights, she told me they were too bright for the neighborhood. The kicker? She left her Christmas tree up until March. Hypocrisy glows brighter than LED bulbs. Story 6. I used to know a guy who was a total one-upper. If you said you ran a 5K, he'd say, "Oh, I did a marathon last year." You'd mention your vacation to Florida, and he'd casually bring up his 2 weeks in Europe. The funniest moment, though, was when someone at a party said they'd broken their wrist in high school. Without missing a beat, this guy said, "Oh, that's nothing. I broke both my arms at once." Someone asked how he did it, and he mumbled something about an extreme sport before changing the subject. Pretty sure he fell off his ego. Story 7. There was this dude at my gym who acted like it was his personal stage. He'd grunt loudly during every rep, flex in front of the mirror after each set, and once yelled, "Beast mode!" while lifting 20-pound dumbbells. But the funniest part? He tried to give unsolicited advice to a personal trainer, telling her she wasn't engaging her core properly. She smiled sweetly, then deadlifted twice his body weight right in front of him. He left early that day, and honestly, the gym's been quieter ever since. Story 8. A woman at work always humble-bragged about her charity runs. One day, someone asked what her favorite charity was. She blanked and said, the one with the running." Story 9. My buddy Greg once tried to impress a girl by claiming he spoke fluent French. When she responded in perfect French, he panicked and said, "Oui, baguette." She left. We never let him live it down. Story 10. I'll never forget this one guy in my friend group, Sam, who thought he was God's gift to humanity. Every conversation with him turned into a monologue about his latest accomplishment, his incredible taste, or why everyone else was wrong about literally everything. We'd be out grabbing burgers, and he'd scoff at our orders like, "You're really getting that? Wow, basic." I remember once telling a funny story about an awkward date, and he cut me off mid-sentence to explain how I should have handled it if I didn't want to look so desperate. He acted like the main character in every room, and if you weren't giving him the attention he thought he deserved, he'd sulk or say something cruel to put the spotlight back on him. The breaking point came during a game night at my place. I made the mistake of suggesting we play a game he wasn't good at. He snapped, accusing me of trying to embarrass him. I told him, "Sam, the world doesn't revolve around you." And he stormed out. Honestly, game night's been way more fun since. Story 11. A guy at a party insisted he could drink anyone under the table. 10 minutes later, he was under the table, snoring. Legend says he's still there. Story 12. I had a neighbor who'd vacuum at 3 a.m. I asked why, and she said, "That's when I get the most energy." I told her, "Well, my energy is to sleep." She suggested I try earplugs. I suggested she try moving. Story 13. When I first met Rachel, she seemed like a cool, confident woman. But as time went on, I realized her confidence was just arrogance wrapped in a pretty bow. She had this way of making you feel small without being outright mean. Like, I remember hosting a dinner party and being excited to try out a new recipe. She took one bite, put down her fork and said, "Not bad. I mean, it's not restaurant quality, but good try." Then there was the time I bought a new car, and she couldn't resist commenting, "Oh, I guess that's a good choice if you're on a budget." She also loved to point out when someone was wrong, loudly. In any argument, she'd say something like, "Well, I guess not everyone can be as informed as me." One day, a mutual friend finally called her out, saying, "Rachel, why do you always have to put people down?" She laughed it off, saying she was just keeping it real. That's when I realized Rachel wasn't keeping it real. She was just a jerk. Story 14. A guy at my gym once yelled, "No pain, no gain," before dropping a medicine ball on his own foot. He limped out, muttering, "I guess I gained something." Story 15. There's this one guy at work, Eric, who could win an Olympic medal in complaining. I'm talking about everything: his job, his wife, the weather, even his lunch. One day he spent 10 minutes ranting about how the office coffee was too bitter, only to follow up with, "But the sweetener packets are bad for you, so what am I supposed to do?" Another time he went off about how nobody here understands how hard his job is, even though he takes more breaks than anyone else. What really got me was how his negativity would snowball. If you tried to vent about something, Eric would hijack the conversation and turn it into a competition of who had it worse. Once I mentioned I was feeling stressed, and he immediately countered with, "You don't know stress until you're in my shoes." I stopped sharing anything with him after that. Eventually, I started eating lunch at my desk just to avoid his endless grumbling. I'll take silence over Eric's drama any day. Story 16. My sister-in-law Karen has this incredible talent for making everything about herself. You could be talking about the weather, and she'd twist it into how it ruined her weekend plans. One time, my husband mentioned a promotion he'd just gotten, and before he could finish, she jumped in with, "Oh, that reminds me of the time I turned down a huge raise because I wanted to follow my passion. Not everyone can do that, you know." When my niece turned 6, Karen threw her a birthday party, but spent most of it talking about how hard she worked to put it all together. I think the worst was at our Thanksgiving dinner last year. I'd made the turkey, stuffing, and pies, and instead of saying thank you, Karen went on about how she would have done it differently and probably saved time using her methods. I wanted to scream. Instead, I smiled, nodded, and poured myself another glass of wine. It's her world. We're just living in it. Story 17. My old boss loved calling himself a people person. He forgot my name 3 times in one meeting. I had worked there for 2 years. Story 18. I had a college roommate named Jake, and if you looked up selfish in the dictionary, his picture would be right there. The guy never lifted a finger around the apartment. Dishes? Always piled up in the sink, trash, overflowing until I caved and took it out. Once I came home to find Jake lounging on the couch eating my leftover pizza, without asking. When I called him out, he shrugged and said, "I figured you wouldn't mind, it's just pizza." But his selfishness wasn't just about chores or food, it was about everything. He'd hog the TV, blast his music at 2 a.m., and never offer to pitch in for household supplies. The kicker was when I confronted him about splitting the electric bill, and he actually said, "I don't use that much electricity, so why should I pay half?" By the end of the semester, I was counting down the days until I could move out. Jake taught me an important life lesson. Always vet your roommates. Story 19. I used to work with this woman named Deborah, and honestly, she was the textbook definition of someone who sucks the air out of the room. Deborah had a knack for turning even the most light-hearted conversations into a complete downer. You could be talking about your weekend plans, and she'd jump in with something like, "Oh, I used to love going out before I realized how pointless it all is. Life's just one big cycle of disappointment, you know?" She wasn't just negative. She was relentlessly negative, to the point where you felt like you needed a shower after spending 5 minutes in her company. Once during a team lunch, someone mentioned they were getting a dog, and Deborah launched into a tirade about how pets just die on you eventually, and you're better off without the heartbreak. The whole table fell silent, and the excitement drained from the poor guy's face. The thing with Deborah was that she didn't just complain about life, she complained about people too. Nothing anyone did was ever good enough. If someone brought donuts to the office, she'd complain they weren't from the right bakery. If someone dressed up for a work event, she'd mutter, "Trying too hard?" Just loud enough for everyone to hear. One time I overheard her berating an intern for using the wrong kind of paper clips. Paper clips. That's when I realized she wasn't just a mood killer. She thrived on making others feel as miserable as she did. But the absolute last straw came during our company holiday party. Everyone was in a festive mood, and we had a secret Santa gift exchange. Deborah opened her gift, some nice scented candles, and immediately said, "Great, because I need more useless junk in my apartment." The woman who had gifted it to her looked crushed. I couldn't take it anymore. I pulled Deborah aside and told her, "Look, you don't have to like the gift, but you don't need to ruin the moment for everyone else. Maybe try saying thank you for once." She just stared at me, completely unbothered, and said, "I'm just being honest." That was the day I decided to avoid her entirely. Life's too short to let someone else's bitterness stick to you. Story 20. Back in college, I had a professor named Dr. Caldwell, and let me tell you, he was the most condescending man I've ever met. He had this way of making you feel like an idiot even when you were right. If someone asked a question during class, he'd sigh dramatically, take off his glasses, and say, "Well, if you'd been paying attention, you'd know the answer already." It was like he enjoyed making students feel small. One time I stayed after class to clarify something about an upcoming paper, and instead of helping, he smirked and said, "It's all in the syllabus, if you'd bothered to read it." I had read the syllabus. His instructions were just that unclear, but what really drove me crazy was how he always needed to prove he was the smartest person in the room. During one lecture, a student made a comment about a historical event, and while the student was mostly correct, Dr. Caldwell tore into him for not getting a tiny detail right. "Actually," he said, dragging out the word like it was a weapon, "if you'd done your research, you'd know that happened in 1848, not 1849. The poor guy turned bright red, and I could see the rest of the class exchange uncomfortable glances. It wasn't like Dr. Caldwell was wrong, but did he really need to humiliate someone over 1 year? The breaking point for me came during a group presentation. My team and I had worked hard, and while we weren't perfect, we'd done well. Dr. Caldwell listened, arms crossed, and then launched into a scathing critique about how we'd missed the bigger picture and failed to engage critically with the material. He spent 10 minutes tearing us down and didn't offer a single piece of constructive feedback. After class, one of my teammates, who'd been struggling with anxiety, burst into tears. That's when I decided to file a formal complaint with the department. Nothing came of it, of course, but it felt good to stand up for myself and my classmates. To this day, I think about how many students Dr. Caldwell must have crushed with his arrogance. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that intelligence means nothing if you can't show a little kindness. Story 21. I'll never forget this woman I used to carpool with, Linda. At first, it seemed like a win-win situation. I'd save on gas, and she'd get a ride to work. But Linda turned out to be the most overbearing, nitpicky person I've ever met. Every morning, she'd comment on my driving, "You're braking too hard. Why don't you take that shortcut?" Or my favorite, "You know, the left lane is for passing." One day I picked her up and she actually told me, "You really should clean your car. It's kind of gross in here." The audacity. But what finally did it was when she started controlling the radio. I'd put on my favorite station, and she'd immediately reach over and change it, saying, "This is too loud for this time of day." I put up with it for weeks because I didn't want to be rude, but eventually I snapped. After one particularly annoying morning, I told her, "Linda, if you want to control everything, you can drive yourself." She tried to argue, but I stuck to it, and let me tell you, the silence on my solo drives has never been sweeter. Story 22. There's this one woman in my neighborhood, Marge, who makes it her mission to comment on everything you do. You're trimming your hedges? You know, you're supposed to do that in the spring. You park your car slightly crooked? That's going to make it harder for other people to park, you know. Once, she actually knocked on my door to tell me my Halloween decorations were a little too scary for the kids. I used to think she was just a busybody until I overheard her gossiping about me at a block party. Did you see how late they had their porch lights on? Some people have no respect for the neighborhood. That was it for me. I stopped trying to be polite and started giving her the cold shoulder. Marge still makes her rounds, but now when she comes my way, I just smile, wave, and walk inside. Life's too short to entertain people who live to criticize. Story 23. I used to be friends with this guy, Chris, who thought he was a walking encyclopedia. No matter the topic, Chris had to jump in with some fun fact or unsolicited correction. You'd say something like, "Oh, I love Italian food," and he'd respond with, "Actually, what we call Italian food in America isn't authentic. Did you know spaghetti and meatballs isn't even a real dish in Italy?" It was exhausting. The worst was when he'd double down on something even when he was clearly wrong. One time, we were at a trivia night, and Chris insisted that Mount Everest wasn't the tallest mountain in the world because it's measured from sea level. We lost the round because of him, and instead of admitting he was wrong, he sulked the rest of the night. Eventually, I realized that being friends with Chris meant always walking on eggshells. So I stopped inviting him to things. He never apologized or even noticed, which kind of says it all. Story 24. There's a guy in my gym, let's call him Tony, who thinks he owns the place. He's always hogging the machines, grunting loudly, and throwing his weights around like he's in some action movie montage. If that weren't bad enough, he spends half the time giving unsolicited advice to anyone nearby. I once saw him tell a woman she was squatting wrong, even though she had perfect form. She smiled politely, but you could tell she wanted to smack him with a dumbbell. What really got me was when he decided to critique my workout. I was doing bench presses, and he came over saying, "You should be lifting heavier if you want results." I bit my tongue, but after the third time he helped, I snapped and told him, "Tony, unless I'm paying you to train me, mind your own business." He gave me a dirty look, but hey, at least he left me alone after that. Story 25. I'll never forget my ex Mark and how he could turn any situation into a pity party for himself. At first I thought he was just sensitive, but over time I realized he thrived on playing the victim. If I was upset about something, he'd somehow make it about him. I'd say, "I had a rough day at work," and he'd reply, "Oh, you think that's bad? My boss is always on my case." Once I was sick with the flu, and instead of helping me, he spent the day complaining about how my being sick was inconvenient for him. But the worst was when I found out he'd been cheating on me. When I confronted him, he had the audacity to say, "Well, if you paid more attention to me, I wouldn't have needed to look elsewhere." That was it for me. I packed my stuff and left, and I haven't looked back since. Mark might still be out there playing the victim, but thankfully I'm no longer part of his story. Story 26. I once dated a guy named Brian who seemed perfect at first, charming, funny, and always the life of the party. But as the months went on, I started to notice this ugly side of him that I couldn't ignore. Brian had this habit of turning everything into a competition, and not in a fun way. If I told him about a tough day at work, he'd immediately jump in with, "Oh, you think that's bad? Let me tell you what I had to deal with." It wasn't just about one-upping me. He had to be the most stressed, the most tired, the most anything. He also had this weird need to win every argument, no matter how small. Once we were out to dinner, and I mentioned that I preferred soft-shell tacos to hard-shell ones. He launched into a whole lecture about why hard shells were superior, complete with hand gestures and stats he'd probably made up on the spot. I laughed it off at first, but it happened again and again. He'd nitpick my opinions on music, movies, even the best way to load a dishwasher. It was exhausting. The real red flag, though, was how Brian treated my friends. He'd make snide comments about their outfits or careers, always masked as jokes. At a party, one of my closest friends mentioned she'd just started a new job, and Brian smirked and said, "Congrats. Must be nice to finally have a real one." She laughed it off, but I could see the hurt in her eyes. I confronted him about it later, and he said, "Oh, come on. You know I'm just teasing. People need to toughen up." That was his excuse for everything. Teasing, joking, just being honest. The final straw came when he tried to correct me in front of my family. My dad was telling a story about his college days, and Brian interrupted to say, "Actually, that's not how it would have worked back then." My dad gave him a polite smile, but I was mortified. After dinner, I told Brian I needed some space, and he rolled his eyes and said, "If you can't handle me, maybe we're not a good match." For once, I agreed with him. Breaking up with Brian felt like shedding a 200-pound weight. Some people just aren't worth the effort.